Hello everyone, welcome. Walaikum salam, Subkaji. I am fine. How about you? Thank you so much for joining. Hi Rohit, welcome. Oh, good to hear. How are you, Rohit? Here is your good name. Welcome. Good to hear, Subkaji. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Comments your name. Hey, dear Rafa. Welcome. How are you? Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Hello, dear Rafa. Good to hear, Rohit. Let's see who is next. Hello, dear Rehan. Here is your good name. Noof or Noor? Hi. Welcome, dear Camilla. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Avni. How are you? Here is your good name. Hi, dear Abid. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Elvish. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Yovraj. Welcome. Here is a good name. Hi, let's see who is next. Hello, dear Shikha. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Janjan. Hi. Here is your good name, dear Janjan. Hi, dear Nikki. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Mansi. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Tawfiq. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining, dear Tawfiq. Hi, dear Noel. Here is your good name. Hi, dear J and D. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Rupa. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Brent. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Kara. How are you? Welcome. Hi, dear Diksha. Here is a good name, dear. Thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear Jamin. Here is a good name. Hi, Susanna and Huria. Hello, dear Susanna and Huria. Thank you so much for joining. Here is yours, Lennox. Hi, dear Lennox. Hello, dear Sita. How are you? Hi, dear Anya. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining, dear Anya. Uh-oh. Hi, dear Fernanda. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Ashen. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Noof. Here is yours. Hi, what is your name? Pedrillo. Hello, dear Pedrillo. Happy birthday. It is a good name, dear. Hi, dear Sonia. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Essen. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Bhavya. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Savvy. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Nafa. Here is a good name. You're most welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello, dear Hari. Hello, dear Angelus. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Gory. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Susanna. Here is your good name. Hi, let's see who is next. Suresh. Hello, dear Suresh. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Mars. Here is a good name. Hello, dear Tejas. Here is a good name. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hi, dear Oliver. Here is yours. Can you do mine? Why not, dear? What's a good name? Hello, dear Suti. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Khadija. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello, dear Shehzad. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hi, dear Chandra. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Hi, dear Anu. Here is a good name, dear Samira. Hello, dear Samira. Here is a good name. Thank you so much for joining. Hello, dear Mia. Here is a good name. What's your name? Chota. Hi, dear Chota. Welcome. Hello, dear Zama. Here is your good name. Hi, dear Shivanya. Here is your good name. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Don't forget to press the subscribe button. Hi, dear Ashik. Here is your good name. Hello, dear Ursulan. Ursulan, welcome. Here is a good name. Hi, dear Ishara. Here is your good name, dear. Thank you so much for joining. Alan or Ayan? Hello, dear Ayan. Here is your good name, dear. Thank you so much for joining. Let's see who is next. Armando. Hi, dear Armando. Here is your good name. What's your name, dear? Happy birthday. Hi, dear Nana. Here is your good name. Beetle. Hello, dear Beetle. Here is your good name. Hi, Adam. Hello, dear Adam. Here is a good name. Musky. Hi, welcome. Hi, dear Zikri. Here is yours, Bhavya. Hello, dear Bhavya. Happy birthday. I am good. How about you, dear? Thank you so much for joining. Dear Nana. Hi, dear Maria. Here is a good name. Let's see who is next. Rosgar. Hello. Here is a good name. Thank you so much. Guys, electricity went off. Let's try. Hello, dear Via. चल सकता है काम के नहीं बट बहुत कम सिग्नल्स आ रहे हैं electricity went off, guys. Let's back to the name. Good job. so we have to compromise.
It's okay. Hi, dear Gujar. Welcome. Hello, guys. How are you? Let me check. ओ अटक गया है क्या? चैट ही नहीं आ रही है भाई. क्या करें? Oh God, दोबारा रीस्टार्ट करते हैं. दोबारा से रीस्टार्ट